Hey, ladies and gentlemen. So this is my first ever podcast. Hopefully this thing goes well. I'm definitely hoping that this becomes a thing. I was sort of debating between this and YouTube, and admittingly a podcast is easier because one, I can kind of do it wherever. Part of the reason I don't typically do these sort of videos, podcast things in my office is because my office has a lot of legal files, and so the last thing I want to do is expose potential client confidences. So this allows me to do that. This allows me to put stuff in my office. And the second thing I'm hoping to do is to get some sponsorship. Right? I'm going to publish this thing, get some sponsorship. To be very clear, I will sell my, not my soul, but I will sell my integrity. I'm kidding. But no, seriously, Coke Zero, hit me up. I'll sponsor you in a heartbeat. Xbox, hit me up. I'll sponsor you in a heartbeat. PlayStation, I'll probably sponsor you, even though haven't played on a PlayStation in forever. Even Android, I will sponsor many things. You can just put a big sponsorship all over my my shirt. People know those NASCAR drivers. So here's the deal. For anybody who is seeing this for the first time, this podcast hopefully is called Phil's Bills. I call it that. It's kind of an inside joke. I'll explain it at another point in time. But basically, I'm an attorney. So I talk a lot about legal stuff, but I'm also a political science wonk. That's my shtick. So you'll see me talk about the intersection of politics and law, the intersection of politics and culture every now and then, and sometimes the intersection of, how do I put this, social policy and politics, and sometimes I'll keep the law out of it. I like to research all of my topics before I speak. I think the biggest thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get ignorance out of politics, and I know I will very easily fail. Right? I'm not going to succeed in that goal, but I'm going to try, and I'm not going to be the guy to perpetuate memified style politics. One thing I hate in politics, one thing I hate in our conversations is a sort of a willingness, the exact opposite of reluctance, to resort to memes in lieu of arguments, right? Double standards in lieu of any standard, and just a lack of knowledge over an understanding, an increasing of true understanding. So I'm also a Republican, right? So a lot of my stuff is going to come through a very conservative perspective, not an extremely conservative perspective. I'm not a Tea Partier. I consider myself center-right. So anybody who doesn't know me, that's where I come from. You can evaluate my biases accordingly. But politics, obviously now is a great time to talk about politics. Elections are abounding, and I'm in California. That's my state. So California likes to do this thing every year where we vote on all sorts of just wonderful things that we hadn't considered on voting before today. So the first of these, I'm going to go... What the next series of podcasts is going to do is I'm going to touch on the propositions, all of them, at least the ones that are still alive. Rest in peace, Prop 9. We hardly knew ye. And I'm going to talk about what's good about them, what's bad about them, and I'm going to go over the ballot arguments in summary and refute them, see where they're right, see where they're wrong. And I give my recommendation for most of these, but I also understand that everyone has sort of a different value structure. So some people are going to listen to this and think, well, yeah, I'm okay with taking those risks. I think that this is something we should pass. And some people are going to say, well, Phil, thank you for informing me of the risk. I'm going to be a hard pass and not vote for this proposition. So I start off with Proposition 1. Proposition 1 is an authorization bond measure. Now, on the outset, authorization bond measures typically pass. They typically pass by about a 3/4 vote. Right? I don't really expect this to go down, especially when you consider what it's purporting to do, which is build homes. Right, that's the number one thing going on in California right now. So you look at Prop 1 and immediately you're thinking, this is a great proposition. It's going to build homes, and we need homes. The state of California And I should say, just stop right here. I research my stuff, right? So if somebody, I don't know if I'm going to ever be able to post links on a podcast. I typically do when I apply this to my Facebook. I research myself. So when I say a fact, it's something I have researched and something I feel comfortable saying. So the state of California has deemed that you need about 180,000 new homes, whether they be single family or whether they be, quote, multifamily, which we'll get in a minute. Those are basically just apartments. But the state of California has deemed that you need those you need 180,000 new homes. Well, we're building about 80,000 of them. So anybody who knows simple math, and admittingly I'm a lawyer, so I don't know simple math, that's about 100,000 difference. That's not a particularly good number. That's a shortage, and anybody who knows simple basic economics of supply and demand, the more money, or the more something is out of supply, the higher it's going to be. So the less supply, the higher the price. Less of a supply of homes are scarce, people fight for the rest of them, and that's why you have the housing crisis that you have. People are coming to California, they can't afford it, so what this proposition purports to do is to make it more affordable. I'm still a no on it, and I'll explain why I'm a no. You may disagree, and a disagreement here wouldn't be illogical, right? I'm a no because I think there are a lot of risks, and I think the state could have done better. And the reason I think the state could have done better is because this authorization doesn't fund just one bond program that builds houses. It funds many bond programs that have very specified goals that don't affect a lot of people. So this thing authorizes up to $4 billion in bond payments. Of that $4 billion, $1 billion goes to veterans. I think that's laudable. I think veterans deserve housing. $300,000 goes to rural migrant workers. I think another $300 million goes to rural migrant workers and developing housing there. I think $450 million goes to victims of domestic violence to get them housing. And I think all that's well and good. And then, there's another $300 million that goes into transit-oriented development, and I'll get into that later, because that's a huge problem for me. And I think all that's good, right? I think those are things we would want to do. My question is why we don't just build them all at once under one program, right, and specify certain goals. When the state passes a bond, when the state creates a bond, it essentially creates a grant program. So people, veterans organizations, housing development organizations can all apply for these grants, and they can be given to them. So if we were to instead say something like, we're going to do $4 billion on all projects, it wouldn't preclude veterans housing. It wouldn't preclude housing for domestic violence victims. It just wouldn't specify that to that degree. And the problem I have for that is many people are not domestic violence victims and do not need domestic violence victim housing, right? I would venture to say probably most of us aren't like that. Most of us are not veterans and don't need veteran housing, right? So when you create a $4 billion program and only $1.5 billion deals with all of California citizenry, is eligible for all of the citizens of California, then I think you've already created a fairly limiting bill by nature. And let me be very clear here. I'm pro-veteran, right? Veterans fight and die for our country. They deserve housing. It's a disgrace that they don't have housing. I'm not saying don't provide them housing. I'm saying that you can do it in a way that isn't so exclusive for non-veterans, right? And so that's the concern that I have. I would never say no to veterans housing, just be very clear on that point. But so the need is simple, right? We need housing. The problem, in addition to what I just described, is about $150 million is going to transit-oriented developing. And transit-oriented developing is poorly defined, which, as a lawyer, I hate poorly defined legislation. Poorly defined legislation irritates the living bejesus out of me, mainly because it creates all sorts of sordid legal arguments that are either good or bad, and we don't know because legislation's ill-defined. And in case you're wondering, transit-oriented developing isn't particularly defined, other than housing that is in, quote, close proximity to a transit station. Why am I irritated about this? Well, it's simple. This bill is earmarking a certain amount for transit-oriented development. Not everybody needs transit-oriented development. As a matter of fact, I would argue that a lot of Californians already have a transit-oriented development in the form of a vehicle. A lot of Californians have cars, right? A lot of Californians drive to work. A lot of Californians will always drive to work. I drive to Modesto. I live in Stockton, right? I live about 30 minutes away from where I drive. There's not a program that's really going to change my calculation. There are other things in my life that might, but not a government program. I find those have very little effect on my behavior. So there's and again, it's ill-defined, right? So if you're in a rural country, or in a rural county, and you don't have a train station, or you only have a train station, you're essentially being precluded from having funds directed to that program, unless those funds orient around transit. That doesn't make a lot of sense for rural workers, because rural workers either work where they live or they work really far from where they live. Right? They work in another county, they work in a farm, they work somewhere else, they work probably minutes and miles away. Right? That isn't, in a way that is not addressed by having a house near a train station. Right? This bill, that makes more sense, obviously, for people like San Francisco, where there are many train stations, there are many transit stations, and there are many areas for which to develop, and where driving, like, for example, in San Francisco, a lot of people don't drive, right? A lot of people hate driving in San Francisco. I don't blame them. I hate driving in San Francisco. But the point is, for those people, this makes sense, right? It creates a high-speed lane of access to them, because that's something that will benefit almost all San Franciscans and benefits them in a very outsized manner. Same thing for Angelenos, right? It benefits them. It benefits any big city, really, except Stockton, which doesn't really have a lot of transit stations. So there's a lot that Stockton would be foreclosed to Stocktonians, Modestans, people in the Central Valley. I don't think they would very clearly be detrimented by that. They would not have access to that special funding, because most of their city isn't around a transit-oriented development. So that's a problem in and of itself, but it gets a little bit stranger when you think about something else that's hidden in this bill. And I want to say something at the outset. The opponent of this bill, the person who said this bill was bad, did a very poor job arguing it, right? He didn't touch on the main arguments. The main argument is a little section. It's called Health and Safety Code Section 54008, subsection B. In that section, and actually, sorry, I scratched that. I can't read my own writing at times. It's actually 59008 sub B. And that code section says that any bond allocation can be transferred to any other bond allocation. So let me repeat that to you. Any allocation that is part of this bond can be switched from one allocation to another. And you might think at the outset, well, that kind of refutes what I was saying earlier about creating special lanes of access. And that's true. But it also goes the other way, right? You could theoretically fund $4 billion, intend for it to go one specific direction, and the legislature could then redirect it all towards transit-oriented development. And if you think that that's kind of an insane, crazy supposition, understand that last year the legislature, Senate Bill 827, tried to do just that. They tried to create a massive program dealing with only transit-oriented development, right? This is why a lot of Californians feel disaffected. This is why you see a lot of Californian state secessionism. And let me be very clear. I'm not a secessionist. I don't believe in New California or anything like that. I don't believe in the New California Republic, for anyone who's ever played Fallout New Vegas. I'm not a secessionist, right? But if you're, in Alpine Country or Alpine County, Calaveras County, Tuolumne, north of Sacramento, even the Central Valley, and you're hearing the state talk about transit-oriented development, you don't really feel like the state's speaking to you, right? Because your issue isn't necessarily driving to work, right? If you're in California and you work in San Francisco, you're already taking public transportation. You don't need a house near a BART station or your train station because it's already a bad commute. That's not going to change the commute. What you need is a house that's affordable. And this bill has a poison pill within it, and I think it's a fairly serious one. It allows the legislature to do as they wish with this money. So all of the allocations that you're told that are happening as a part of this bill may not happen. They could happen something completely different. The legislature could just transfer funding from one entity to another entity without you knowing it. And that might be a problem because, again, that a lot of these special lanes of access, a lot of these special lanes of funding don't affect the majority of Californians. They don't affect people where I come from, right? They don't speak to our issues. So this bill sounds like it speaks to our issue, but oftentimes it doesn't. The other problem that this bill has, that this bond proposal has, is that it proposes a lot of funding for multifamily programming. So the $1.5 billion that is spent on kind of a generalized housing development spends on apartments. That's what a multifamily housing development is. It's just apartments. There's obviously a certain sector of the population that is benefited from that. I theoretically, I could be part of that. I am of renting age, right? I know a lot of my friends are of renting age. I'm sure they would love the idea for rents to go down, and quite honestly, they should. But there are a lot of people who aren't of renting age and who are looking to start families. And a lot of people who are looking to start families don't typically embrace the apartment option. Now, some do, and some only, that's their only option, and I get that. I wouldn't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is only for multifamily housing. Again, a lot of my issue with this bill isn't that it spends on things. It's that it only spends on certain things. It's that it's very exclusive in what it does and does not represent. I think something that would be a lot more general in scope, that would talk about all forms of housing, including, single family housing, the standard house, and apartments, would be a much better bill. Something that would be far more easy for me to support. And then, of course, again, it has the poison pill, which kind of negates everything I said, but also at the same time hypercharges it, right? It makes what I'm saying even worse because it puts everything in the hands of a legislature, which typically represents big city interests and not necessarily the interests of the Central Valley and not necessarily the interests of rural communities. So those are just massive problems I have with this bill, and that's not even talking about bond indebtedness. Now, your mileage may vary on this. A lot of the arguments I previously made, I was hoping to make to a wider swath of a cross-ideological spectrum, right? Not fellow Republicans do this for that, but fellow Californians do this for that. And I think the next argument I'm about to make is a cross-ideological argument, but I'd be remiss if I did not say historically that argument is typically wielded by Republicans. So when we talk about bond indebtedness, bonds don't raise taxes. That's very true. Bonds don't raise taxes. Your taxes are not going to go directly up as a result of Proposition 1. But, and it's a big but, right? One that would make Sir Mix-a-Lot blush. That's how big this but is. It probably causes us more taxes in the long run. So this bond will only add about, I think it's like $179 million to the general fund obligation. So in other words, $150 million of our tax dollars for the next 35 years, that's the period of bond repayment, will go towards paying this bond. However, bonds don't exist in a vacuum. This is not the first bond that people have passed. And for anybody who doesn't know, a bond is basically it's a financial investment wherein the legislature or any entity sells a piece of paper that basically creates indebtedness on their part. And in turn, for buying that piece of paper, the legislature or the seller gets money up front, but promises to repay the buyer at an interest rate for the next 35 years. So when bonds come to maturity, is when the buyer of the bond is supposed to be fully repaid. So when you do a bond, you're not just getting free money. That bond has to be repaid, right? And typically it takes about 35 years. But California has sent up a lot of general obligation bonds. And I gotta be honest, guys, this was not an easy statistic to find. I was shocked. I thought it would be one of the easier statistics to find, because a lot of this stuff should be generally recorded and should be generally easy to find. But it was not. It was not. It was very, very, very difficult to locate. And there's a lot of numbers out there. And basically what I was able to do, going through the State Treasurer's website, was isolate a specific number. And that specific number is California currently has $179 billion in bond obligations. If you divide that by about 30 years, which is the general term of repayment, you're looking at about $5 billion a year in general obligation bond repayments alone. Now, that's a lot of transportation funding. That's a lot of education funding. That's not going to education funding. It's going to repay taxes, right? And so the legislature then faces itself with an obligation. Do you keep funding levels the same and just have a lot of the general fund eat that up? Or do you raise taxes so that you can keep the funding levels for the programs you want the same, without having the general bond obligations eat it up? And as we saw recently with the gas tax, sometimes that is a form of a tax, right? So the idea that this does not create taxes is true directly, but probably true indirectly, or untrue indirectly. In other words, indirectly this creates a tax because it creates and it eats up our general fund, and the legislature is going to have to find ways to pay back the bonds and fund its current priorities. And the way they typically do that is to either raise taxes or cut funds. This legislature doesn't seem like the type to cut funds either now or 2 decades from now. So taxes could easily go up, right? It may be property taxes. You may see a repeal of Prop 13. It may be just general use sales taxes. Who knows? It could be income tax, right? They'll find a way. They have to. Because while this bond in and of itself isn't going to be the camel that breaks the camel's back, or excuse me, the straw that breaks the camel's back, other bonds will be. It adds up. It's like rungs in a ladder, right? That's how California now has $179 billion in general bond issued obligations, right? It isn't one bond that was $179 billion worth. It was other bonds. It's accumulation of bonds. So even if, you talk about yearly repayment, yeah, it's only 170 or 150 million or whatever. But when you add that up, we're talking about $5 billion to repay back all the bonds California currently has now, by my calculations. And again, these numbers weren't easy to find, so my calculations could be wrong. So it's an issue. And it's an issue where we have to be very careful about this. So if we're going to do bond indebtedness, and again, this is kind of a balance of values, right? Sometimes it's worth the risk, right? I don't think Prop 1 is worth the risk because I think it creates specialized funding and not generalized funding. And what we need right now is generalized funding that we can all apply to, not specialized funding. So when you weigh that risk versus the contributing to this continuing bond debt, to me, that's a no. Now, you may look at that and weigh the risks differently and be a yes, and I totally understand. The point of this podcast is to make arguments, but it's also to inform, right? The reason I have for having these arguments is such that that it leads me to that conclusion. But you can take that information and lead to a different conclusion. So I also wanted to critique the arguments, right? So like I said earlier, the arguments against are really bad. They don't touch upon anything that I mentioned, except maybe the general bond indebtedness. But it was a really bad and really structured argument. So the only argument they make against is that it's going to lead to higher property taxes due to bond indebtedness. It's a similar argument that I just made, but they don't talk about the poison pill. They don't talk about how all of these programs can immediately be funded into transit-based development or general-based development or a specialized fund like rural migrants or domestic violence victims. And again, I'm not saying that they don't deserve housing. I'm saying that if you created a general pot from where all of these groups could get housing, then you would still have a situation where everybody would be able to meet their needs, right? More houses for everybody means more houses for rural migrants. It means more houses for domestic violence victims, and a more accessible grant process for everybody means still that those DV advocacy groups, those rural advocacy groups, and those veterans advocacy groups can still access this money, right? The problem is, again, that it's exclusionary. So that really touches on the arguments for this bill. It will increase housing. That's hopefully true. This program does go to specific programs that increase apartment housing, and it increases housings for certain specified groups that I have mentioned probably too much already. But it doesn't necessarily create a generalized solution to a generalized problem. Right, it takes on specific facets of the problem and touches it from there. So the first argument is that this increases housing. That's technically true, but not as true as it should be. The second argument is that this doesn't raise taxes. I already discussed that. It doesn't directly, but probably does indirectly, by bond indebtedness. The third argument is that this helps people live where they work. It's vague, right? Because, again, I don't know what close proximity to a transit station means. That's what the bill literally describes. But even if it wasn't vague, there are a lot of people who will never be able to live where they work because San Francisco and the Bay Area have priced out most Americans, most Californians, right? So those people have to live out here in order to get work. I know plenty of people. I was one of those people at one time. So the idea that this bill will change that, it seems far-fetched, especially when it doesn't do anything to create new single-family housing. And fourth is an econ boost. This is entirely speculative. I assume the argument is it creates new construction. I suppose so, but if my arguments and my predictions about a future tax increase come true, it's going to take money out of those people later. You get econ boost now, but you may get economic depression, not depression in that sense, but like an economic disincentive later, right? It may be a depressant on the economy in like 5 to 10 years because you keep creating these bonds and they keep going up and up and up and up. So long and short of it is, ladies and gentlemen, the arguments for it are somewhat true but specious. This bill is somewhat exclusionary, and I think ill-designed, and has a very important poison pill that kind of puts the whole program and explodes it anyway. So for those reasons, I'm personally a no. Although I certainly would understand why people would be a yes. Anyhow, this wraps up my first podcast. Let me know what you think. I appreciate comments. I appreciate critique. Let me know one way or another. I appreciate it. And pleasure to meet y'all. Adios.